Hi everyone. We're going to start the third part of our class. In the first part, we learned what art was. We learned themes in art. We looked at the elements and principles of art. And then we began the second part of the class. In the second part of the class, we looked at the different mediums in art. We looked at drawing, we looked at painting and printmaking and sculpture and architecture, photography. And now in the third part, we're going to look at art around the world and art in history. We began the class with a discussion on cave art and shaman, and that would have been in the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age. Today we're going to start in the New Stone Age. We're going to look at some of the arts of Mesopotamia, and then we are going to go to Egypt. In the next class, we will look at the world of sacred art in Hinduism and Buddhism, and we will also look at art from Africa in sub-Saharan art. Then we'll move to Greek art and Roman art in the ancient world. We'll look at the Middle Ages. Then we'll move to the Renaissance. I will talk about Baroque art, and then we will start in modern art from 1800 to 1945. We'll then end things with modern to postmodern art from 1945 to around now. And along the ways, we will also look at performance art and their relationship to celebrity art. And then I also have a extra credit discussion on a LA group called the LA Cool School. So let's get started with Neolithic, Mesopotamia, and Egyptian art. And the Egyptian art part is titled An Art for Immortality. So in the Stone Age, the Old Stone Age, the Paleolithic Age, humans were surviving pretty well as hunters in smaller groups. They were gathering, they were hunting, they were nomadic. And we saw an example of the shamanistic practices from the San people in Africa. Now we're moving into the next stage, the Stone Age, meaning that we're using stone and bone tools. We haven't got into metallurgy, where we are melting materials to create metals like bronze and ultimately iron. So the Neolithic Age begins around 10,000 BC and then ends somewhere around the Bronze Age between 4500 BC and 2000 BC, depending on where you are in the world. So bronze ultimately is going to be kind of where we're headed with the Egyptians. So in the Neolithic world, we find a couple of things. We find people learn how to farm. They learn how to plant seeds, have those seeds grow. They understand the way that the earth moves from longest days to shortest days, when you have to plant to get rain, to get things to grow. They understand that by also having an abundance of things, to where they have a surplus, say, of grain. And when they have that surplus of grain, they're able to trade it for other things. So in the Paleolithic world, you had to kind of do everything. You had to be your own doctor, you had to be your own hunter, you had to be your own cook, you had to be your own architect. Now we're seeing a kind of specialization that will begin to happen. So when you'll have people who are just farming, you will have people that are protecting those farms, because now that people are stable and not migrating, there are going to be rivalries for better land, for use. They're also building permanent houses. And when they start building permanent houses, they start to acquire more things too. As a nomad, you can only really keep what you can carry. So we'll start to see permanent villages being built. So from farming, kind of everything kind of begins. We also have seen animal husbandry and that we are now breeding animals and domesticating animals. So we are taking giant aurochs, wild cows, wild bulls, and cattle, and we are forming them into cattle for slaughter and also beasts of burden to help us plow our farms. Also, we are learning how to weave. So we are no longer wearing animal pelts, but we are able to weave fibers and to have those fibers on things like looms. And with the looms, we're able to make kind of clothes and draperies that we will wear. Things have changed dramatically in the Neolithic Age. So evidence of the Neolithic Age also shows us these kind of permanent religious sites as well, like in Stonehenge. So in Stonehenge, we know that it's probably at least 5,000 years old. We believe that these monumental stones were cut and dragged and then ultimately placed in this circle, and that we believe that what they were like a celestial clock. And we also believe that people are worshiping the sun, worshiping the moon, worshiping the cycles of life. We believe that farming is leading towards gods that relate to fertility. In the Bronze Age. So in the Bronze Age, we are finding that people have learned how to melt by making fires in kilns, heating them up with large bellows, that we are able to superheat fire to the point that it can melt copper, it can melt tin, and copper and tin is kind of the more traditional way to make bronze. And bronze then will make bronze tools and bronze weapons that will be ultimately stronger and more capable than the stone tools before them. The other thing about bronze is that to make it right, copper and tin are rare to find. And because it's rare, that the areas of the world that are kind of becoming ethnically similar, like the Romans and the Greeks and the Egyptians, they're going to have to trade with each other. They're going to have to get along. And that's going to also kind of help humanity in terms of trading ideas, trading, obviously, food products, trading other products like olive oil with the Greeks, and also trading in the materials to make bronze. Mesopotamia is known as the cradle of modern civilization. It is a Bronze Age kind of mecca with cities like Sumer and the Akkadians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians. And all of them are going to have times where they're very powerful in this Fertile Crescent, in this area between the mountainous areas in Asia Minor and in Iran, and where these rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, run. So in this area here, you're going to find really good farmland. And that farmland is going to ultimately help to create these very strong city-states. And in these city-states, they're going to build large pyramid ziggurats. They're going to have large cities. They're going to be trading. They're going to be farming. They're going to be making new technologies. And especially, they're going to start writing. Cuneiform is one of the earliest forms of a codified form of writing that they are making into clay. And by pushing the tip of a stylus into clay, they're making these marks that then are going to record everything. They're going to be used for accounting. They're going to be used for law. They're going to be used for mythologies. And especially, they're going to help these civilizations that have long disappeared. We are going to find their writing. We are going to ultimately figure out what the writing, how that writing is interpreted, what it means. And we're going to learn a lot about these civilizations. And they're also going to make quite a bit of art as well. So Ur is one of the oldest of the cities. And in Ur, we have a restored ziggurat that contained the shrine of Nana. And she is an important goddess in relationship to fertility and farming. Her other name is Isis. This ziggurat would have been a temple complex that would be an administrative center, and then also was a shrine for the moon god Nana. In the bottom, we're looking at the votive sculptures that we found from Tel Asmar. They are ranging from just a few inches to 30 inches tall, and they are carved out of stone. And I think what's really interesting about this art are the wild, staring eyes. So these sculptures are standing in for people praying. So rather than you praying 24-hour days to keep favor with the gods, they are praying for you. So these votives are standing in for you, never blinking, always making sure that the gods are getting their praises. Now, the types of religions that are going on, we have a polytheistic type of society, multiple gods. So we have the god of wisdom and magic, Anu, the sky god, Enlil, the god of the earth and storms and agriculture and the controller of the fates. Is the creator and protector of humanity in both the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of the Great Flood. Two stories that we have found numerous writings on in cuneiform, in tablets. This is way before paper was invented. So they believe that the world was a flat disk surrounded by huge holed space, and above that was heaven. They also believe that water was everywhere, the top, the bottom, and the sides, and that the universe was born from an enormous sea. So we're looking at some cylinder seals here. The cylinder seals would be made by carving either stone or making ceramic, making something out of clay, and then having that clay fired to make it solid, like we'd seen with the ceramics earlier. And then you're carving relief sculptures in it. And then you take those relief sculptures and you put them in wet clay, and as you roll the seal then rolls out the images. So on the top, we're looking at the sun god Shamash. Shamash is always shown with this hat here. He's holding a blade that is beginning to emerge between two square-topped mountains. The water god Az stands to the right with 1 foot placed on the right hand of the mountain and stretching out his right hand towards an eagle. And a conchant bull lies between his legs, and streams of water and fish flow from his shoulders. So we're seeing the gods relating here to natural phenomenon. Below, we are looking at a bas-relief of Shamash, the sun god, and beneath the symbols of the moon are the symbols of sun, the moon, and Venus. And he is seated in the position in a shrine, holding a measuring rod and a reel of cord. There is another large sun disk in front of him on the altar, suspended by 2 figures. Of the 3 figures on the left, the central one is dressed in the same fashion as Shamash, and is soon to be the Babylonian king, Nabu-apla Idina, and receiving symbols from the deity. So from Shamash, we're going to also see one of the most important things that we find in the Mesopotamian area, which is this stele. So this stele is in Babylon, and the stele is about 6 feet tall, and it is an example of a finger being raised. At the top of it is Shamash giving the laws to the king Hammurabi. The bottom of the stele, which is in cuneiform, The whole bottom of the stele is all of these written laws, 282 laws with punishments, eye for eye kind of punishment. So if you steal, you get your hand cut off. Although it is asserted that that is kind of the most strict punishment. You might, the first time someone steals bread, give them a lesser punishment and say, hey, you know, by the written law, we can take your hand. So I don't believe that they did that immediately, but I think it also depends on how high the people were who were having the offenses against them. Probably, if somebody was very high in society, like a priest or someone, and you stole their bread, probably the worst thing would happen to you. And then also, the third of the stele is dealing with contracts and addressing how inheritance and divorce and paternity and sexual behavior is supposed to happen. So this is an early example of a fundamental law regulating government. So again, this is what the laws would look like. This is how cuneiform looks. So it's made by a stylus. It has a rectangular end in it, and then these shapes are probably coming from pictographs. So probably coming from literal direct images that are then being taken into a abstract form, and that abstract form is probably leading us closer to things like the alphabet. One of the great stories that we know from Mesopotamia is the Epic of Gilgamesh. So in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there are several different versions of it. We are mostly dealing with King Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and Enkidu, a wild man created by the gods to stop him from oppressing the people of Uruk. There are other forms of Enkidu as well, where Enkidu was another king. Gilgamesh and Enkidu become friends after an initial wrestling match. They ultimately are going to go on several journeys. They will kill the bull of heaven, which the goddess Ishtar, and Ishtar is the other name for Inanna, not, I said Isis earlier, sorry about that. Ishtar. So she is going to punish Gilgamesh for spurning her advances on him, and then as a punishment, the gods sentence Enkidu to death. So in the second half of the epic, Gilgamesh is going to take a journey to discover eternal life, and eventually learns that you will never find eternal life, because when the gods created man, they let death be part of life, and only the gods could remain immortal. And this is ultimately kind of one of the lessons to be learned here, that this part God, part man king who could do a lot of things, ultimately death was something that would be waiting for them. So moving on to Egypt, and again, an art for immortality. So we've seen kind of some of the early work in the northern part of where civilizations are forming. And we're seeing kind of civilizations forming in three places in Asia Minor and Asia. We're finding it in the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia. We're finding it along the River Nile in Egypt. And then it's also happening between some rivers in China as well. And these are the big, stable governments and ultimately types of empires that are forming. So when we look at ancient Egypt, we think about stability, that it is set up with pharaohs, set up with a polytheistic religion, and that religion and those pharaohs are going to be very stable for a few thousand years. And part of this is because of the Nile River, and I'll get to that in a moment. So they have been organized as a bureaucracy. They are writing in hieroglyphs, and they also have a form of alphabet too that they're using. They have religious leaders. They are administrators under the control of the pharaoh, and the pharaoh is making sure that the cycles of the season and the flooding of the Nile are going to remain intact. They achieve great irrigation systems and agricultural production techniques, and also some of the first ships. And they are also writers as well. And they are writing things about the gods, and in fact, their afterlife is some of the greatest works of literature, maybe, in terms of, complete imagination, completely imagining what this afterlife is all about. We are looking at one of the greatest artifacts, maybe, in Egypt, the golden death mask of a pharaoh who died when he was very young, Tutankhamun, whose ultimately his tomb was discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter and discovered pretty much intact. And it's really one of the first times that we have found evidence of the tombs. We certainly see the Great Pyramids, but all of those artifacts had been looted thousands of years ago for the most part, and very little things remain. So in these tombs, the pharaoh is mummified, their vital organs are put into jars, they are given stores of food, they have maps and stories to lead them into the afterlife, and they are taking their possessions with them as well. So they are burying massive amounts of wealth in the ground. That's what the human beings that we saw from the Paleolithic era, who are making beads and things and burying them in the ground, this has taken it to a totally different level. So we're looking at the young Tutankhamun here, made out of gold that has been hammered. He has a vulture's head and the head of a cobra. Both of those are symbols for the unification of Upper Egypt near the mountains and then Lower Egypt near the delta. He also has a pharaohic headdress of lapis lazuli and gold, and also wearing the pharaohic beard as well. So the Nile. So here we see what the Nile looks like in Egypt. So basically you're looking at a desert where not a lot is able to grow here from the heat, but because of the flooding of the Nile, which is bringing all of this black, rich dirt from the mountains and this fresh water, the overflowing of the Nile is allowing for really fertile farmland. And then by creating irrigation where you can control where the water is flowing, the Egyptians are able not only to sustain themselves and feed themselves, but they are also protected from armies that would have to cross through lots of really harsh desert and then fight at the end of it. And that is also helping to keep Egypt very stable. We have found paintings, and the paintings that we have found are usually either on papyrus scrolls or they are on the walls of various buildings and temples and tombs. So here we're looking at Nabamun. This is from around 1350 BC. Nabamun is shown hunting birds in a small boat with his wife, Hatshepsut, who will become the queen and a pharaoh herself. Their young daughter is in the marshes of the Nile, and these scenes are part of traditional tomb chapel decorations that show the dead tomb owner enjoying themselves, seeing beauty in this afterlife. The ancient Egyptian religion. And again, we know a lot about the religion because of all the time they spent with the tombs, with the tomb of Tutankhamun that we found, and especially the papyrus scrolls and again, the hieroglyphs that are in these tombs. They're making architecture that you can read like a book. So the religion centers on the interaction of many deities, is polytheistic again, and the religious practice centers on the pharaoh, the king. The king is a human, but is descended from the gods, and I'll show you what gods specifically. They are acting as an intermediary between the people and the gods, and are obligated to sustain the gods through rituals and offerings that could maintain the order in the universe. Individuals could interact with gods for their own purposes, appealing through their help through prayer and compelling them to act through magic. At various times, certain gods become preeminent over the others. The sun god Ra, for example, and the creator god Amun, and then the mother god Isis. We're going to see them in a few minutes. The sun god ultimately is going to be, of course, a very important god, keeping the seasons alive and keeping that harsh desert that is keeping enemies alive. So the depictions of the gods are not necessarily literal, but gave recognizable forms to abstract deities using symbolic imagery to indicate their role in nature. For example, Anubis. Anubis is the Egyptian god of the dead, represented as a jackal or a man with a head of a jackal. Anubis's power was used for the mummification and protection of the dead. Anubis had the head of a jackal because they resembled death, as these jackals would roam around cemeteries and eat bodies. And then the hieroglyphs are telling us the story, as we're also seeing illustrated pieces from their books of the dead. So the sun god Ra is the first pharaoh of the world, and when the gods inhabit Egypt, he would have a golden ship and would sail across the sky and then return to the underground world of the Duat. And he would sail in the river of darkness and fight off monsters. So the Egyptians celebrate each sunrise when Ra emerges victorious again, causing a new day to begin. After many centuries, Ra becomes old and senile and retreats into the heaven, giving up his throne to Osiris. So Ra was considered the king of the gods and the patron of the pharaoh, and one of the central gods in the Egyptian pantheon. Now, as things are kind of moving forward, the Egyptians are building solar temples in honor of Ra, and unlike the standard kind of Egyptian temples, these temples were open to sunlight and did not feature a statue of the god because he was represented by sunlight itself. Instead, the temple centered on an obelisk and an altar, and the most significant early solar temple is thought to be one erected in the Heliopolis, sometimes known as the New Phoenix, and the location was thought to be the spot where Ra first emerged in the beginning of creation. So Ra, the god, the sun god, has the head of a falcon and the sun disk inside of a cobra resting on his head. So sun disk and a cobra, and then head of a falcon. That is the father of the gods. Osiris is the son of Geb and Nut. Geb is the earth god, Nut is the sky god. He is the pharaoh who takes over after Ra. He teaches men about farming, creates the first cities in Egypt, but he had a jealous brother named Set. And Set tricks him into laying down in a golden coffin and then seals the coffin and cuts it into pieces. Set scatters all the pieces all over Egypt, and then his wife Isis spends years searching for them, eventually putting the husband back together, binding him in cloth, and making him the first mummy. But Osiris only partially comes back to life. And the reason is that one of the pieces that Isis is not able to find is his penis. And because he can't find his penis, he can't come back as a fully formed man. So he becomes the god of the underworld, sitting in judgment over the souls of the dead. He appears as a king with blue skin in white robes. They depict him as a handsome man, and he is also wearing the crown of Upper Egypt as a plumed headdress known as the ARTH. that is carrying a crook and a flail that are symbols of his kingship. And he is the one who is sitting in judgment for people, waiting for people to die and lead them into a paradise. Horus is the son of Isis and Osiris, and he himself is transformed into a falcon, and he flies around his body, drawing his seed into her. So this is how Horus is born, by Isis and Osiris. Osiris leaves the underworld and goes into hiding in the delta region of Egypt to protect herself and her son from Set. When Horus grows into manhood, he challenges Set and eventually defeats him, becoming the new pharaoh of Egypt. Afterwards, all mortal pharaohs consider themselves to be descendants of Horus. Horus's symbol was a falcon, and he's often pictured as a man with a falcon's head. He also is there to meet you when you die. He's the one that's going to guide you to the afterworld. So he is worshipped in the same way as other gods. Temples are built as homes for the god, and there is a clergy of Horus, a cult that always associated with themselves and claim protection from their mother, claimed for the protection for their mother Isis. The Egyptian afterlife. With the evolution of writing, religious ideals are recorded and quickly spread throughout the Egyptian community. The solidification and commencement of these doctrines were formed in the creation of afterlife texts, which illustrate and explain what the dead would need to know in order to complete the journey safely. So they believed in the underworld and eternal life and the rebirth of the soul. The underworld, known as the Duat, had only one entrance that could be reached by traveling through the tomb of the deceased. The initial image, a soul, would be presented upon entering the realm. There was a corridor lined with statues, including variations of Horus, and then they are taken into that deceased world for their eternal life. And again, this fully formed eternal life. And the tombs are really interesting in terms of the world that they are creating in this afterlife, in this underground. In terms of great art, we see the pyramids of Giza here. So the pyramids of Giza, built on the Giza Plateau, were made by 3 human pharaohs, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Each pyramid is part of a royal mortuary complex that included a temple at its base and a long stone causeway leading east from the plateau to a valley temple at the edge of floodplain. The most northern is the oldest of the pyramids. This is the second king of the 4th dynasty, called the Great Pyramid, and is the largest of the 3. Khufu's pyramid is rising at angles of 51 degrees and is accurately representing the cardinal points of north, south, east, and west. The pyramid's core is yellow limestone blocks. The outer and inner passages are finer light-colored limestone, and the interior burial chamber is built with huge blocks of granite. There's a head of the Sphinx and the body of the Sphinx that Egyptologists believe to be that of King Khafre. And now these pyramids have been looted and have been there for thousands of years, and we don't know really that much about them because we have found them empty. We only kind of suspect kind of what they are, what we know about the religions. So the Great Sphinx outside of the pyramids is a limestone statue of a reclining lion, a sphinx, standing on the Giza Plateau. It's about 240 feet long and is guarding the entrance to the Greek city, the later Greeks will conquer Egypt, of Thebes, and is asking riddles of travelers, allowing them to pass. The qualities of the Sphinx have really fascinated people since. Sigmund Freud will later describe the question of where babies come from is the riddle of the Sphinx. So the Sphinx was said to offer a riddle to travelers to allow them to pass. What creature has one voice and yet becomes two-footed, becomes four-footed and two-footed and three-footed, and if you were not able to answer, you were strangled. Oedipus solves the riddle by answering man, who crawls on all fours as a baby, then walks on 2 feet as an adult, and then uses a walking stick in old age to walk. So 4 legs to 2 legs to 3 legs. In the art that we find, so not only have we been mostly looking at art that has included the funeral mask of King Tut, we have looked at the pyramids, we've looked at the Sphinx. We also here have the royal sculpture of the pharaohs, and we looked at this statue in our sculpture lecture. So this is Menkaure. He would have had the smallest of the 3 great pyramids, his wife Queen Khmerabti. This is a frontal carving where we see the pharaoh with 1 foot in front of the other. We see the body not really anatomically defined as much as kind of generally defined. We see them wearing robes that have lines cut into them. With Khmerabti, she is wearing a robe all the way to her feet, and we see the indication of knees, the pubic triangle, a little bit of the stomach, and the breasts. So they are kind of standing in a way that shows her affection for the king, and he is standing in a way that shows him as kind of being a powerful warrior and also holding on to some kind of scrolls. Now, the non-pharaohic sculpture, like the seated scribe here, notice not quite as powerful, maybe a little more naturalistic, we could say, rather than so stylized. So this seated scribe is dated around 2600, around the same time as the pyramids, limestone, seated position, and holding a roll of papyrus, and then the face is looking at us. And not looking at us in terms of power, but looking at us as if he's waiting for us to say something for him to write down. He's in a writing position. Also from the Egyptians, we have a lot of literature, not only literature on the books of the dead. Now, we don't have the kind of literature that the Greeks write in terms of metaphysics. How do we know what we know? But we have found a scroll called the Teaching of Keti. And in the Teaching of Keti, it's a father who is taking his son to learn how to be a scribe, to learn how to write. And the son doesn't want to go. Son would rather do something else. So along the way, the father is showing them all the different other things he could do with his life. And so you begin to see the manual labor. So you see a coppersmith working at the door of the furnace, and his fingers are like the claws of a crocodile, and he stinks from the work. You're seeing people smushing grapes to make wine, and their feet are stained. So you're seeing farmers who are bent over picking crops, and their backs are permanently bent. So you're seeing the physical consequences of picking certain occupations. And so what his father tells him is, Kete says to his son, look, when you're a scribe, you learn how to write, you learn how to read, you become a different class of person, you hang out with priests, you hang out with noble people, you learn how to count, and your body does not become broken from the back-breaking labor. And by the end of this, his son realizes that maybe being a scribe isn't such a bad thing. So basically, the old kingdom is pretty stable. They are worshiping the same gods, they're keeping power intact, and then Akhenaten comes along, and he's ruling around 1300 BC, so this is over 1,000 years from the Great Pyramid, and he is abandoning the Egyptian polytheism, and he is worshiping Aten. And Aten he is worshiping the sun itself. He's not worshiping Ra. Ra was pulling the sun, right? The sun, they were not worshiping the sun itself, but they were worshiping the mechanics of whoever was making the sun move and rise every day. Now, Akhenaten is worshiping the specific sun itself. And in this, we see kind of a new kind of art that is a little more humanistic. Here, we're seeing Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti, and they are playing with their children. This is not the typical kind of pharaohic image of a warrior, instead one that is more domestic. Now, what we're going to mostly know about Akhenaten in terms of what we find in 1922 is going to come from Tutankhamun. So Tutankhamun has a connection to Nefertiti, who we believe is his mother, and this new religion is not going to last for very long. Basically, Akhenaten is going to have a very powerful reign, but ultimately weaker children like Tutankhamun are going to die young, and that's going to ultimately overturn this new religion worshiping Aten because there's a lot of bad luck going on in Egypt at the same time. So they are attributing this bad luck to changing the religion, and then they will try very hard to stamp out that Akhenaten ever existed. We learn quite a bit about Akhenaten through the tomb of Tutankhamun, where we have a golden throne with hieroglyphs, we have burial papyruses, we have the coffins, and we also have the funerary masks. We learn quite a bit about how the burials work in Egypt. So this is the lecture on an art for immortality. So the art for immortality is really centering around the Egyptians. I give you Mesopotamia and the Neolithic kind of to have some kind of broad understanding of it. I have an optional discussion here. Now, depending on the class, if this is a fall or a spring class, this class will, you'll need to do this as part of the class. So I'm going to have you look at a few videos. I want you to think about kind of the art that we've looked at, and then I'm curious what you think about the art that they've made. So, did their idea of immortality come true? I mean, we are talking about them 5,000 years later. So why do you think immortality beyond the body is so important to human beings? And anything that you can not only just say, I also want you to kind of prove or illustrate or show it by telling me examples from the videos or from the lecture. Always back up your assertions rather than just simply making a statement. And why do you think there's so many half human, half animal images from the Neolithic and Egyptian art? This is a lecture that talks about that somewhat. And then also, we can look at one of the underground tombs too. And then from Khan Academy, we have a document that talks about the kinds of gods and warrior gods and pyramid builders that we might also find in other places in the world, like the Mayans and Teotihuacan. Okay, so that is going to be the lecture for today. And I want you to take a look at all this Egyptian stuff and think about the idea of art being made in the service of religion, and also a type of art and writing that assures a form of afterlife immortality. Look forward to seeing your thoughts. Talk to you soon.